This is the final act, and it plays as one long tragedy. A young king has already taken the throne of the greatest empire on earth. It is not enough. He burns its ceremonial heart in a single night of wine and vengeance. He marches past every border the known world can set him, into deserts and river valleys no Greek has ever seen. He dreams of fusing conqueror and conquered into one new people. Nature cannot stop him. His enemies cannot stop him. In the end, he is defeated only by his own exhausted soldiers who simply want to go home. And what he leaves behind, dying young in a fever at Babylon, is not the empire he imagined, but something stranger and far more lasting. His road now leads to the greatest prize of all, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. Darius the Third began it. Xerxes completed it long before Alexander was born. It is among the most famous places in the world and among the most closed. Ordinary travelers are forbidden. Only a Persian or subject of Persia may enter, and only for the great New Year festival held each spring, in the month that answers to April. On those days, the peoples of the empire bring their tribute to the great king. Courtiers descended from the ancient Medes lead each delegation forward. Every nation comes in its own dress, receives one brief audience, and looks upon a figure otherwise unapproachable, enthroned in silent majesty. Alexander brings his army to Persepolis in the autumn, and settles in for the whole winter, making the palace his base. He revels in its immense hall of columns. Each tall stone pillar is crowned by the carved image of a bull or a lion, and on their backs rest the mighty beams of the roof. Overhead still stretch the original cedar logs shipped to Darius from the forests of Lebanon by the Phoenicians, back in the 6th century BC. For a whole season, the conqueror lives inside the very symbol of Persian power, sleeping beneath a ceiling older than the long wall that carried him here. By May, the season for war returns, and Alexander still has not caught Darius. There is a cold political reason to hunt him down. A fugitive king can always become a banner for revolt against Macedonian rule. But the deeper force is something the Greeks call Pothos, his restless yearning to see what lies beyond the horizon. Before leaving Persepolis in the spring of 330 BC, he throws a great feast for his Macedonian officers and for the women who have followed the army through everything across Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Men and women pour into the great hall wearing garlands of flowers. A famous harper sings the king's praises. The wine flows heavier, and the last inhibitions fall away. Then a young Athenian woman rises. Her name is Thais, a favorite of the king. She rebukes him he has not truly finished his work. Her own city once burned when Xerxes and the Persians torched the temples on the Athenian Acropolis. What, she demands, has Alexander done to repay that outrage? Goaded by her words, he snatches up a torch and hurls it into the rich hangings draped along the wall. Flame races up the dry cloth. His companions join in, laughing, flinging fire. Some of the pillars are wood, not stone, and as the torches strike them, the blaze swallows the vast hall. Alexander sobers fast and sees he is destroying his own most magnificent building. Too late. The fire cannot be quenched, and Persepolis burns to the ground. What the fire left behind can still be seen. 19th century explorers found the site much as it stands today, columns rising alone on a desert plateau, on a high stone platform whose walls are carved with Persians and their subjects, with camels and trees and flowers and tribute gifts from across the known world. Above them lived a few gaunt pillars, cracked and blackened by the flames of that night. Nearby lie the fallen capitals, the bulls and the lions that once held up the cedars of Lebanon, now toppled into the dust. The 17th century English poet John Dryden made that night the subject of his poem, Alexander's Feast. He ended with Thais, who, in his words, led the way to light him to his prey and, like another Helen, fired another Troy. Before that ending, Dryden turned to Alexander and to all conquerors who blazed across the world, leaving war and ruin behind, and asked what it was all for. War, he sang, is toil and trouble, honor but an empty bubble, never ending, still beginning, fighting still, and still destroying. If the world is worth the winning, the poet urged, then surely it is worth enjoying. But Alexander was not a man to heed such a call. For him, the battle never ended, and the quest was eternal. The thought of sitting back to enjoy what he had won never once entered his mind. His restlessness turned the world upside down. It brought much that was new and precious into history, and it shattered the peace of many peoples for many years. That same restlessness now drives him after the one prize still escaping him. From Persepolis he marches north and at last closes on Darius near the Caspian Sea. But Darius has already been abandoned by his own exhausted companions, who despair of a king who can neither stand and fight nor rally his men. When he refuses to go a step further, they bind him in golden chains to the throne on his cart, run him through with spears, and leave him to be dragged wherever the horses will take him. The horses make for water. And it is at a lonely waterhole that Alexander finds the body of the man he has chased across the world, deserted and utterly alone. How Darius died soon mattered less than what his death could be made to mean. The historian Arrian says the great king was already dead when Alexander arrived, and that is almost certainly true. But other writers stage a final scene. The dying Darius wishing Alexander well and passing him the kingship as his rightful heir. Such a blessing would have counted for much. Alexander had already been treated almost as a son by Darius's own mother, who never spoke to her real son again, yet grew fond of her conqueror. But that bond carried no legal weight. Without a true succession, Alexander was only a man who had seized an empire by force. And Pothos, a kinsman of Darius, still lived, a rival claimant to the throne. The despot scene may have been invented to make a conqueror look like a king. With Darius gone, nothing lies ahead but the open east, and Pothos pulls him onward. He drives into the land he calls Bactria, in what is now Afghanistan, fighting war after grinding war. He pushes on through the Khyber Pass and down onto the plains of the Indus in present-day Pakistan, and crosses at last into what we now call India. There he meets King Porus, who fields a wall of war elephants and knows exactly how to use them. Yet Alexander and his hardened Macedonians break even that, winning their battles and taking the cities of the Indus Valley by siege. No army in the world has yet found a way to stop him. Then he learns that a short march east will bring him to the headwaters of another great river, the sacred Ganges, running toward the very edge of the world. That, he announces, is where he will go. But his soldiers have followed him for years, all the way from Macedon, and they mutiny. They will not take another step. Undefeated by nature, undefeated by every enemy, Alexander is finally defeated by his own men. They cannot share his Pothos, his hunger for what lies beyond. They only want to go home. He retreats into his tent and sulks, waiting like Achilles for them to relent. This time, they do not, and so, for the first time, he gives way. So the great advance becomes a long bitter retreat. They turn back down the Indus. Alexander has fallen ill and is carried on a galley. The other ships ordered to keep their distance so the beat of their oars will not disturb the sleeping king. The journey home is a catastrophe. He misjudges the land and is badly advised about the country between India and Mesopotamia, never grasping that it holds one of the driest and cruelest deserts on earth. Part of his fleet sails home by sea under Nearchos, a friend from his boyhood. Alexander himself leads his troops overland, straight through the Gedrosian desert. Men die by the thousands of hunger and thirst and heat, and the army that finally staggers out is broken by what it has suffered. Rejoining the fleet, Alexander returns homewards through Mesopotamia. His road passes beneath the Behistun rock, one of the wonders of the Persian world. There, centuries before, the first Darius had carved a towering image of himself, high on the cliff, 1 foot on a fallen enemy, a line of bound rivals roped before him. Beside the image runs a long inscription cut in 3 languages proclaiming how he crushed his rivals, seized power, and rose as the great king of kings. Now Alexander, the new great king of that same empire, rides in the dust below and lifts his eyes to his illustrious predecessor, set high above him on the rock, one conqueror gazing up at another across the gulf of 200 years. His destination is Babylon, which he now means to make the capital of the world. His head is full of ships. He plans an armada of thousands of vessels to conquer the whole Mediterranean. He will drive a great highway from Egypt to the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Heracles, and use it as a war road against Carthage and on into Europe. One fleet will sail all the way around Arabia. Another will cross the Caspian Sea to seize whatever lands lie beyond it. His ambition has no edge, no limit. The old story that Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer gets him exactly wrong. He wept because, with a universe of worlds still before him, he had not yet managed to fully conquer even one. Yet as he nears the city meant to be his capital, the gods themselves seem to warn him off. Before he can reach the gates, the priests of Babylon come out to meet him. Do not enter, they say. The omens are dark. The gods have foretold that he will risk his very life by coming inside. But Alexander does not take well to threats, or to any hint that he should back down. Once, warned that his own physician meant to poison him, he simply drank the medicine down, rather than yield. So the warning fails. He asks only which gate is the proper one to approach, then leads his whole army around and enters by another, refusing to retreat even before the gods. At Babylon, Alexander begins a series of measures that show how far he has traveled from the 20-year-old who crossed the Hellespont a decade before at the head of a fresh young army. His vision has changed. He no longer wants to be king only of Macedonians and the Greeks. He wants to be king of the Persians too, and to fuse these peoples into one, exactly as Cyrus, whom he now claims as his spiritual ancestor, once bound the victorious Persians and the beaten Medes into a single new partnership of rulers and ruled. The liberator has begun to dream like the empire he destroyed. To that end, he does several things that horrify his Macedonians. He begins to appear in Persian dress, trousers, and all, the costume they most despise. He stages mass marriages to bind the two peoples by blood, choosing 92 Macedonians, himself among them, to take 92 noble Persian women as brides in one vast public ceremony that blesses every union at once. And he raises a whole generation of young Persians to be Macedonian in spirit. He calls them the successors, puts them through the standard Macedonian training, and pours attention and affection on them when they come to him at Babylon. To his old soldiers, their king is turning into the very thing they marched out to defeat. Then he holds an enormous feast. And to it he invites not only his Macedonians, but the Persian nobles and commanders, telling them, as they sit side by side, that they must rule the world together as partners. He hands Persian lords governorships and army commands. More and more he plays the part of a god. It is too much. His veterans mutiny again, jeering that he can go and fight his wars alone, since his so-called father, the god Ammon, will surely stand beside him. This time, Alexander explodes. He wades into the ranks, striking men down with his own hands, and orders the ringleaders killed on the spot. He has already destroyed old companions he suspected of treason. Step by step, he becomes the eastern tyrant of every Greek nightmare, whose will is law and who bows to no human justice. Alexander now turns to the Greeks, those distant, troublesome people. As he disbands his armies and sends his Greek soldiers home, he wants their cities to take them back. But the Greeks still seeing themselves free. They submitted to Alexander only as hegemon, supreme commander, and never handed him their governments. So it lands like a thunderclap when, in the Olympic year of 324 BC, his envoy appears at Olympia, the very ground where Herodotus once recited his history of the Persian Wars, and Isocrates once preached Greek unity against Persia. The envoy carries the exile's decree. Many men in Alexander's army had been driven out of their home cities as troublemakers, and now he orders every city to take its exiles back. Their old lands have long since been seized and given away. The Greek world cedes, and the decree turns Greece against him. When the Greeks demand to know by what right he commands such a thing, the same envoy delivers the answer. Alexander may now fittingly be worshipped as a god, a son of Zeus. The Athenians reply with a shrug. He can be a son of Zeus if he likes, they say, and a son of Poseidon too, for all they care, wholly unmoved by his claims to divinity. And so many who had known Alexander in his youth turn against him at the last, even as his fame grows across the Persian Empire, which had braced for a merciless conqueror and found instead a man who honored their traditions and dreamed of joining Greek and Persian into one new world. Amid all this comes the loss that breaks him. After the return from India, Alexander's dearest friend, Hephaestion, dies without warning. A strong young man, he falls ill and burns with fever after a huge drinking party. Against his doctor's orders to go gently on food and wine, he had devoured a whole chicken and washed it down with jar after jar. Alexander grieves as though the great love of his life has been torn away. Hephaestion had always been the Patroclus to his Achilles, and now the king feels that half of himself has simply vanished. For days he mourns without stopping, and something in him seems to reach after death, longing to follow his friend into the next world. For the funeral, Alexander orders a monstrous pyre built out of ships. Quinqueremes, warships even larger than triremes, are to be lined in long rows to form a great square, with smaller squares stacked above, platform upon platform, their bronze rams jutting outward and gleaming. At the very summit will stand images of the sirens, who once lured sailors to their deaths, and inside each siren a living person will sing, as though the spirit of the creature gives voice from within the statue. Whether those singers are meant to burn is never made clear. Alexander is no longer thinking as a rational man. The structure is never finished. Even for him, the idea of feeding a whole fleet to the flames proves too much. But the grief has opened something, a deep despair and a sudden sense of his own death. As his grief deepens, the omens begin to gather around him. At Babylon, the king himself falls ill and the strange signs pile up. Out on the river one day, a gust of wind lifts his hat from his head, and for a king that hat is a crown and carries it into the water. A Macedonian dives in after it. Needing both hands to swim back, he sets the crown on his own head to keep it dry. He is rewarded for saving it, and then flogged for the terrible omen of having placed the king's crown on another man's brow, a gesture that seemed to whisper that royal power was passing away from Alexander. Babylon kept an old custom. Once a year, the true king would step down, and the substitute, a mock ruler for a single day, would take the throne to be jeered and mocked, so the people could pour out to this jester every grievance they could never speak to the real king. There was a famous case from the Bronze Age, when word came that the true king had died on the very day the substitute sat enthroned, and the substitute refused to rise and became the king in earnest. That old story echoes horribly when a madman is suddenly found sitting on Alexander's own throne, and no one can say who he is or how he came there. The omens keep stacking up, all seeming to point at one dreadful fate, and they may well be working on Alexander's own mind. Then the fate they foretell arrives. Not long after Hephaestion's death, Alexander sinks into a violent fever. Modern scholars, like the ancients before them, cannot agree whether it was illness or poison. Some pointed at Roxane, the Eastern woman he had married, now carrying his child, but hundreds of people had reason to want him dead, and any of them might have slipped him poison. He falls into a state just short of a coma, barely able to speak or move. When his soldiers understand that the end has come, they file past him one by one to say farewell, weeping that the man who had made them into gods and heroes is passing out of the world. And so in Babylon, Alexander dies. His body is embalmed for the long journey home to Macedonia, and at once the great struggle over his empire begins. The age that opens we call Hellenistic because Alexander carried Greek traditions and culture deep into Asia, where they fused with local ways into a hybrid world, part Greek and part native. The people who lived through it called it the Age of the Successors. His empire is carved up at once among his generals into rival warring kingdoms. Ptolemy makes himself pharaoh of Egypt and founds its last dynasty of kings, the line that ends centuries later with Cleopatra, herself a descendant of that same Macedonian Ptolemy. Across the shattered empire, Macedonian soldiers set themselves up as lords over the pieces of a world their king had won and could no longer hold. That empire had been the Persian Empire, and with Alexander, it simply ceased to exist. In the very same year, the world of the free Greek city-states came to its end as well. Both the Persian Empire and the independent Greek polis died together in 323 BC. But the other dream that had seized Alexander at the last, the harmony of Greek and Persian, did not die. He had carried Greece into Asia, scattering Hellenic ideas of city planning and architecture, government and philosophy, art and religion wherever he marched. Alexandrias and Alexandropolises rose in his wake, and inside them a new kind of world civilization began to take shape. That was his real legacy, the deepest fruit of the long war between Greeks and Persians. And so the long war that began with Cyrus and Croesus, that sundered at Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis, that set the free city against the great king across 150 years, ended not in the triumph of one side, but in the passing of both. In a single year, the Persian Empire and the free Greek city each vanished from the earth, and from their ashes rose something neither had ever intended. One cosmopolitan civilization, Greek and Asian at once, stretching from the Nile to the Indus. That fused world was the true burning crown Alexander left behind. He never wore it. He never saw it finished. And we live among its embers still,